I'm Joe Funderburk, Professor of Entomology at the University of Florida. I'm in the Department of Entomology and Nematology, and I'm headquartered at the North Florida Research and Education Center. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the Thysanoptera or thrips. Why are they important? Thrips are not a particularly large order of insects, but they've emerged since the movement of plant material or the trade in horticultural plants in the 1980s, and they've emerged as some of the world's most significant worldwide problems. And there's certain aspects of their biology that makes them particularly good invaders and also makes them extremely difficult to manage. We use the traditional classification system for the Thysanoptera, which recognizes 2 suborders and 9 families of Thripidae. The suborder Tubulifera has only 1 family in it, the Phlaeothripidae, which has over 3,000 species. All of the rest of the families are in the suborder Terebrantia. By far and away the most important one of the families in this suborder is the family Thripidae, which has about 1,750 species. And most of our economically important ones are in this family. The other common families that you will encounter are the Aeolithripidae with about 200 species and the Heterothripidae with about 70 species. I'm going to utilize the western flower thrips or Frankliniella occidentalis as an example in the introduction. It is a Terebrantian species. This slide shows the different life stages of Frankliniella occidentalis. The egg, in it being a Terebrantian thrips, is inserted directly into the plant material. There are 2 larval instars, and with thrips there are at least 2 pupae. I've labeled the first one as pupae 1 here. You'll frequently see that referred to as the propupa. There is sexual dimorphism in many species of thrips, including the Frankliniella occidentalis, with the male being considerably smaller than the female. As I mentioned, the Thysanoptera are some of the most commonly encountered species at ports of entry. There's the certain aspects of their biology that makes them particularly good invaders. The eggs are inserted in the Terebrantian thrips are inserted directly into the plant material, and so they can survive treatment with pesticides. The egg is fairly resistant to heat treatment, and it can survive prolonged periods of being refrigerated. The reproductive potential is very high in thrips. As using the western flower thrips as the example, the females begin laying eggs on day 2 or 3, and then depending on nutritional sources, they will continuously develop or lay 2 to 7 eggs for 20 to 40 days, depending on the individual. The number of plant species that are attacked, many of these species are polyphagous, including the western flower thrips. This includes many agronomic crops, fruit crops, horticultural, ornamental crops, as well as vegetable crops. And it should also be pointed out that many plant species are hosts in many plant families, but thrips also utilize species of plants that are not necessarily hosts, where they're breeding, where they're feeding on those plants, utilizing the plant as, and this accounts for, in many cases, for the ability or for the plants to be transported in international trade. Thrips are the vectors of the Tospoviruses, which are some of the most serious plant diseases in the world. They've also been spread across the world. Aspects of Thrips biology makes them particularly amenable to developing resistance to insecticides. And in fact, Western flower thrips, when it invaded the United States, populations were already resistant to most of the traditional classes of insecticides. And since that time, populations have developed resistance to many of our newer chemical classes of insecticides as well. Using Western flower thrips as an example, which is a pest of many different crops, but utilizing tomato for the example, the eggs, the Western flower thrips is basically a flower inhabitor, although it can be found on other plant parts and utilize those plant parts for feeding, but it's primarily a flower inhabitor. And damage in tomato primarily occurs during the blooming of the crop. The female lays the eggs directly into the small developing fruit of the flower, and then as the fruit develops, you'll see a small indentation. Sometimes this is called halo spotting, and this occurs in many different crops, including grapes and apples. And in those cases, it can serve as an entryway for microorganisms which can cause fruit rot. In the middle slide picture here, you have thrips feeding injury, and in this case it can occur later where the thrips are literally hiding under a leaf, and both the larvae and the adults feed the same, and it's a punch and suck type of injury. They punch a number of cells at one time typically and suck the contents of each of those cells out, so it leaves essentially corky tissue, which is causing this yellow coloring on the fruit. Tospoviruses are systemic. They are systemic viruses. They are reproducing in the plant. They also reproduce in the insect vector, by the way. But so the injury to the plant will be spread throughout the whole plant. And here I'm showing the ring spotting, which is typical deformities that you see on the fruits of an infected plant. In this case, once a plant is infected, then all of the yield on that plant is unmarketable. I mentioned the invasiveness of the Thysanoptera, and they are very difficult to detect, also because of their thigmotactic behavior, which means they like to hide in crevices, and they're very cryptic. Obviously, polyphagy increases the probability of introduction and establishment, is that populations can be continually being brought in on many different species of plants, many types of plants. Another aspect which enhances the invasiveness of thrips is this haploid-diploid sex determination. In the case of Western flower thrips, which are arenatochous, meaning that the unmated females produce male offspring, and the mated females produce female offspring. But a female that's introduced can mate with her own offspring and create a founder population in that way. I mentioned that there are 7,200 species, recognized species of thrips that have been described, and 90% of those are listed as pests, but it's more likely that the smaller number of those are actually causing significant damage. Of course, just because a thrips is feeding on a plant doesn't necessarily mean that it's causing economic damage to that plant. So just the fact that you have a species that feeds on a plant does not necessarily make it a significant pest. And most of the pest species are in two genera, in Thrips and Franklinella, although certainly we have some emerging pests such as Thrips dorsalis, which occur in other genera and are very significant pests. Currently, 20 species are cosmopolitan, meaning they've been spread around the world by the trade of plants and have become established around the world. There are, Tospoviruses are in the family Bunyaviridae, and there's currently 20 species of Tospoviruses that are recognized. In the case of tomato spotted wilt virus, which is probably the most economically important, there are over 1,000 species of plants that are known to be affected, and these occur in both monocot and dicot plant families. There is a very specific virus-vector relationship between the Thrips and the Tospovirus, and at this time we know that there are 14 species of Thrips that are confirmed vectors, and they are all in the family Thripidae, but this does not mean that other species of Thrips can't vector Tospoviruses. These are the collaborators. Are there any questions?
Are all Thrips species plant feeders?
Are all Thrips species plant feeders? No. In fact, the majority of species in the Phleothripidae are fungal feeders, are adapted for feeding on fungi. Some of the Phleothripidae are plant feeders, and some are actually predatory, such as the species of carniole thrips. The Heterothripidae are plant feeders. The Aeolothripidae, in fact, are predatory. Species of the Aeolothripidae are predatory, and species of Thripidae are primarily plant feeders. However, some are additionally facultative predators. For example, Franklinella occidentalis or the western flower thrips will feed on spider mites.
Do all Thrips species have larvae 1, larvae 2, pupa 1, and pupa 2?
The majority of Thrips species in all of the families, except for the Phleothripidae, have a larva 1, a larva 2, and a propupa and pupa. The Phleothripidae have 2 larval instars, but they also have 3 pupae. And I frequently see in the literature that the first pupa is called the primipupa, and then you have the propupa and the pupa.
Are there other classification systems recognized for Thrips?
The classification system that we recognize and are using is the traditional classification system. There is one other classification system from Butte, in which he recognizes actually as the Thrips as 2 orders of insects, and he recognizes 40 families. But this classification system is really not related, does not consider the relationships between the organisms. It's more of a pure classification system.